In today's tutorial, we're going to do a walkthrough of a piano improvisation in kind of a slow and easy jazz style, something that you might think of as a cocktail piano style of playing. What I'm going to do is play through the improvisation, then we'll think briefly about the chords that I'm using, and also talk a little bit about my right hand choices, how I'm thinking about the melody notes that I'm using, and then we'll drag the improvisation back on screen and go through it step by step so that hopefully you can take some of these ideas and play around with them for yourselves. Now there's a free PDF that goes along with this lesson. It contains the chord progression that we're going to use. Also in there is an example realization of a left hand part that you can copy if you want to, plus one or two other hints and tips and bits and pieces that you might find useful. Like I said, that PDF is completely free. You don't need to sign up or anything like that. If you look in the description text right underneath this video on its YouTube watch page, you will find a Google Drive link. Just click that and you can download that PDF either right now or once you've finished watching the tutorial. Okay, so let's play through this improvisation. What I'll do is just play through it once and I'll put the chords that I'm going to use in subtitles at the bottom of the screen. Okay, now a couple of health warnings for you. First of all, those chords that you see in the subtitles will be the basic underlying chords that I'm just using as a starting point. Okay, so if you see something like an F7 in those chords, you're not necessarily going to see me play an F7 chord. Most of the time what I will do is either use a chord extension, okay, like a kind of rootless voicing like that, or even a chord substitution, yeah, like a tritone substitution. We'll talk about those things shortly, but a lot of those chords you won't see appear in their kind of pure forms. Okay. Also, I'm going to play around with the timings, what we call the harmonic rhythm of this progression. So very often you'll see those chords coming in ahead of the beat or maybe behind the beat. So if you're counting along, it might seem like I'm playing those chords in the wrong places, but that is very much deliberate. I'm playing around with that harmonic rhythm for effect. Okay, so let's have a play through and then, like I said, we'll talk about exactly what I've been doing. Just before we walk through what I was doing there, let's have a look at the chords that I was using, because as I've already said, I was taking this basic underlying progression and really messing around with it, yeah? And the more you can get the hang of doing that, the better the sound you'll be able to create, the better equipped you'll be when you take this to the piano to try it for yourself. Now if you look in the PDF, which remember you can download using the Google Drive link in the description text below, if you look in that PDF you'll see the full chord progression, which looks like this. And you might think it looks kind of fairly long and fairly complicated, but actually it isn't. That's because there's an awful lot of repetition in here, as you may have noticed when I played through a minute or two ago. This progression is actually probably the most common chord progression in all of jazz and blues and cocktail and whatever after 12-bar blues. Okay, it's often called rhythm changes, and it crops up in literally hundreds of different songs, and you will most often come across it in the key of B flat, which is the key it's in here, and the version of it we have here is one of the most common ones. There are slight variations in it, so you'll find versions which have a plain G7 chord or maybe a G minor 7 or whatever instead of the G7 flat 9s that we've got, but this is one of the most common versions. It has an AABA structure, again very, very common in jazz songs. What that basically means is we have 4 sections, and each of those sections is 8 bars, 8 measures long. Now, all of the A sections are pretty similar. There are some slight variations between them, especially in the final 2 bars, excuse me, of the second and fourth A sections, but for the most part they are pretty similar. And they are based around this kind of backbone sequence of B flat major 7, G7 flat 9, C minor 7, and F7. Now, as I said, you would almost certainly never play an F7 chord. We'll come on to that in a second. And if you look at one of the A sections, you will see that that 4-chord sequence repeats itself at least twice. Okay, and so it repeats itself twice in the second A section and the final A section, and in the first A section it repeats itself 3 times. We've also got this B flat major 7, B flat 7, E flat major 7, E flat minor 7, so a little sequence. So in the first A section that is bars 5 and 6. We'll come on to that in a second. Let's start off by looking at this little backbone sequence. Okay, so the B flat major 7 chord, I almost always played there. If your piano is a bit twonky and out of tune, you might want to play that as a shell chord, okay? But if your piano is well in tune, or if you're playing a keyboard or a digital piano, that should be fine as a full chord. It won't sound too muddy. Then the G7 flat 9 chord you have a few options with. Sometimes I was playing it entirely rootless, just there, yeah? Now a full G7 flat 9, you can't play easily in one hand because it has 5 notes in it. So very often I was playing it as a rootless voicing, or maybe mixing it up with that shell just there. It doesn't matter that it's rootless. Yeah, you could look at that and say, yeah, actually that's an F diminished 7 chord, which strictly speaking it is, yeah, but that's not really a big deal. We can think of it as a G7 flat 9, and sometimes we can drop in the root, sometimes not, sometimes we can play it as a shell chord, whatever. The most important thing is to kind of consistently communicate the character of that chord, okay? So if it says G7 flat 9, you don't have to have that flat 9th in all the time, but have it in enough so that you're telling your listener that that is the sound of that bit of the progression. Then there's the C minor 7 chord, which, you know, is quite easy to play just there. You can extend it if you want to. It'll extend quite nicely up into that shape, again rootless, or you can think of that as a substitution. You know, you're playing an E flat major 7 instead, but if you just stick to that, that will be absolutely fine. And then the F7. Now in jazz, dominant chords, 5 chords, which is what the F chord is here because we're in the key of B flat major. So the F chord is dominant, it's the one that really wants to take us back to the start of the progression. Dominant chords in jazz are almost always substituted. You will virtually never hear someone play a plain vanilla F chord. Now, thinking back to what I did a couple of minutes ago, virtually every time I was substituting that F7, I used a tritone substitution, something like that, okay, or something similar to it. If you're not familiar with the concept of tritone substitutions, it's really, really simple. Our regular F7 chord is there. To make the tritone substitution, we find the note that is a tritone above the root of that chord. So the root is F. A tritone is 3 whole steps, 3 whole tones. 1, 2, 3. So that's B. And then we build a dominant 7th chord off that B. So that gives us B7. And that functions as a dominant chord in the key of B flat just as effectively as F7 does, because it contains, if you want to know the details, it contains those 2 tendency tones, A and E flat, which are also in the F7 chord. which resolve really neatly to the B flat major 7, yeah? But it just sounds a bit more exotic. There are various other things you can do with it. You can put an F in the bass, that's quite a nice kind of effect, yeah? Or you can substitute it with a C diminished 7 chord, that works quite nicely as well. But the basic concept of the tritone substitution is really kind of bread and butter in jazz, and it's really worth getting it under your fingers. The other thing I did with the F7 chord, and I probably only did this once or twice, was play it as a rootless F13 voicing, okay, which is there. So if you imagine your basic F7 there, I'm missing out the F, missing out the root, I'm playing the 7th here, and I'm dropping in various other notes that would feature in the F13. I'm not playing the full F13. If you wanted to be a pedant, you could say it was, you know, a different kind of chord in particular. I had a bit of an argument about this on a comment thread the other week, but I would call this an F13, okay? What you also might do is just snatch the F in the bass there as well, just to establish the root there. But that's the other thing that I did with the F7 chord. Now, the other thing that happens in the A section is this B flat major 7, B flat 7, E flat minor 7. This thing, yeah, okay, which is really straightforward. I did this kind of thing with it, so B flat major 7, B flat 7, I did a kind of little suspension thing there, which is cool on the E flat. The other thing I think I might have done with it was play it as a rootless 9th voicing, so I extended the chord up to B flat 9, that works quite nicely as well. E flat major 7, again you could extend it. E flat minor 7 extends really nicely. Okay, really simple, really common little sequence, and then it takes you back to the B flat. So that's all of the A sections. As I said, the second and the fourth A section are slightly different because their final 2 bars, final 2 measures just go B flat major 7, F7, or substitution of F7 back to B flat major 7, because they either finish the piece or they lead into the B section. Now that B section is a little bit different because 2 things happen. First of all, we have quite a dramatic apparent key change. Whether or not it's a key change or not is kind of moot, but we'll leave that to one side for today. The other thing that happens is the harmonic rhythm really changes. So we go from having 2 chords in every bar, 2 chords in every measure, to having 1 chord in every bar, and each chord lasting for 2 bars. So we have 2 bars of D7, which you could kind of extend to a rootless 9th, which is quite nice. Then we had 2 bars of G7, which works really nicely as a rootless G13. Okay, rootless voicings are really common in jazz. Okay, if you're playing in a band, you can usually rely on the bass player to fill in the root for you, but even if you're not, if you're playing solo, you can usually rely on your listener's ear to figure out what the root of the chord is. So don't get too obsessed about making sure the root of the chord is always there. If you're playing fancy extensions, there's no way you could play a G13 in one hand. Okay, so you know, make it rootless by all means. C7, what did I do when I was playing through? I probably did this. I played it just as a rootless 9th. And then the F7, I think I played as a 13th again. And I might have snatched the root down there. Can't quite remember. But that's all quite straightforward as B section goes. What's happening really there, if you want to know the theory, is that we're jumping onto the circle of fifths a couple of stops up from the dominant chord. So the dominant chord is the F7, or whatever we play it as, and we are jumping onto the circle of fifths at D7, resolving down to G7, which is the 5th below D, resolving down to C7, which is the 5th below G, resolving down to F7, which is our dominant chord. It takes us back to the start of the A section. Let's not get into the circle of fifths here, but that is basically what is happening. So here we are back at the start of the improvisation. What I'm going to do to start with is just take us through the first few seconds, because right from the get-go I want to think about the way the 2 hands are working together to create a sense of forward movement. Okay, we've already thought about the left hand chords. The right hand, the kind of melodic improvisation, I'll come on to in a few minutes. Okay, so if you're new to that kind of thing, don't worry, I'm going to give you some tips to get started there. But for now, let's just look at how these 2 hands work together. Let's go all the way back to the fade in and just watch the first few seconds. Okay, right away you can see there's actually quite a lot of movement in the left hand there. I'm moving the left because I want to create a sense of forward motion, of movement. This isn't a really dead slow improvisation. Neither is it super quick, and neither is it in really strict time. Yeah, I'm playing around with the time and the pulse, for expressive purposes, but I still want a sense of forward motion. So I'm moving that left hand around quite a bit. I'm not using any kind of pattern. Sometimes you might use a stride pattern or a walking bass. I'm not doing that. I'm just using static positions, but I'm moving them fairly often and in quite a rhythmic way. Let's just look again at a specific example of that. Here we go. There's the B flat major 7. And did you see how I jumped to the G7 flat 9 chord, a rootless voicing of it, there was no G in there, very quickly? Okay, so I held on to the B flat chord and then just really quickly snatched at that G7 flat 9 before landing on the C minor 7. This is what I mean when I was talking earlier about playing around with the harmonic rhythm. Strictly speaking, that G7 flat 9, according to the chord progression, should last for 2 beats. It didn't last anything like that long. Okay, so I stretched out the B flat chord. I was very briefly on the G7 flat 9 chord, and I probably came in slightly early on the C minor 7 chord. Let's just look at that again. Actually, more or less bang on what the beat would be with the C minor 7 chord there, but you can still get a sense of what I'm doing. Now, it's difficult to consciously time that. You have to kind of do it by instinct, by feel. So to start with, if your movements in the left are fairly tied to the beat, don't worry about it. It's when you've practiced this through quite a few times that you'll begin to get a feel for how to play around with that rhythm in the left, okay? So I'm kind of doing that throughout. Things got a little bit more static in the middle section. We'll come on to that shortly. But I've got a certain amount of movement going on in the left, but I'm not overdoing it. Yeah, the temptation always is to feel that you need to do more in the left, but you can always get by with less than you think. Okay. The other thing that I'm doing throughout the piece, you'll notice, is using the left hand to fill in kind of the space between phrases in the right. So a really important thing in the right hand, we'll talk about this in a minute, is how I'm trying to shape phrases. So sometimes the right hand is pausing, the left hand is sometimes just filling in those pauses a little bit. Let's see if there's an example of that here. I think there is. So right hand pauses there. Yeah, really simple one at the start there. The right hand plays its first little phrase. It's really simple. It pauses on the G and then the left hand jumps. Let's just watch that. New phrase begins. And again, the right hand there ends its phrase on the D, and there's a little bit of movement in the left just to keep things going. No particular reason, there's no necessity to do that, but it just helps to give a sense of movement. Here we go. And there again. Yeah, so it's all about the interplay between the two hands. We're creating that rhythmic movement, that forward motion, by letting the two hands kind of work together. And just when there's a little bit of a gap in the phrasing in the right, the left hand can, not always, but often can jump in and just fill in a little bit of motion. Now let's have a think about what I'm doing and the decisions I'm making in the right hand here. First thing to say is that this right hand part is very, very melodic. Okay, there are various ways I can improvise in the right hand. I can improvise melody lines as I am doing here, but I could also use chord shapes. I could use little riffs and licks, or probably most commonly use a mixture of those things. What I've done here is purely used melodic improvisation throughout, pretty much, and that's kind of in some ways a bit unnatural. I had to kind of force it a bit, but I want to kind of get you into this stuff using melodic improvisation because I think that's the easiest way to get started. So bear that in mind. Secondly, if you're really new to this and you've never improvised before, then don't let all this kind of apparently complex stuff kind of blow your mind too much, okay? If you are new to improvisation, there is a really simple way into it, and that is to practice your left hand to start with and get a confident, solid left hand just playing the chords. But then in the right hand, start improvising on a limited number of notes, and by that I mean a really limited number of notes, maybe just 1 or 2. So to start with, practice your left hand and then maybe just improvise on that D and that F, which are both notes of the B flat major scale, the scale of the key that we're in, and then gradually, as you build out in confidence over quite a long period of time, grow out to using 3 notes, 4 notes, 5 notes, whatever, borrowed from a variety of scales, which we'll talk about in a second. So that's the way to get started. If you're completely new to this, what I suggest you do is check out my series of tutorials on jazz piano for beginners. I'll put a playlist link to that in the description text underneath this video, and also I'll include a link in the PDF which accompanies the video, which again you can download below. Okay, so if you're new to this and if all the stuff I'm about to talk about sounds like magic, yeah, don't worry too much, because you can make things much easier for yourself just by limiting the number of notes that you're going to use. So let's start off looking at what I did in that right hand at the very beginning, because it was really simple. Here we go. So a really simple right hand phrase. All of those notes are taken from the B flat major scale, which is, in case you don't know, B flat, C, D, E flat, F, G and A. And I just played D, E flat, F, G and back to F as a simple phrase. Phrasing is really important. You don't have to play notes all the time, and in fact if you do play all the notes all the time, it sounds pretty terrible and pretty boring, yeah? So we're thinking about creating phrases. We'll talk more about that in a second. We've got a short phrase to begin with, and it's followed, answered you might say, by a longer phrase. So there's our short phrase, and there's a longer phrase. Now that longer phrase also pretty much uses the notes of the B flat major scale, but with a couple of additions. Okay, let's look at that again. So our opening phrase. Yeah, I used what you might call some chromatic notes. I used G flat, A flat and D flat. Now the D flat and the A flat both belong to the blues scale of B flat. Okay, so they are very standard blues notes in the key of B flat major. The G flat, F sharp, whatever you want to call it, was a diminished sixth. Yeah, a very common note in jazz. It appears in various modes and things like that. It appears in the whole tone scale. This is a thing I'll talk about in a second. I didn't think, as I ran up there, that I'm using this scale, that scale, whatever. I thought mainly in terms of the B flat scale from point to point, but borrowed some notes from elsewhere, mainly on the basis of what I knew would sound okay. Yeah. So that second phrase is basically running from one point in the B flat scale to another point with some chromatic notes in between. Notice how I used the same kind of starting point as I did for my first phrase. So you might say that this second phrase was kind of a development of the first phrase. We had a short little phrase followed by a longer phrase. Here we go again. Let's hear them both again. First phrase. Second phrase, development of it. Okay, very often this happens when you're thinking about phrasing, and it's not something that you can do to start with, easily. When you're thinking about phrasing, often you'll use a short phrase followed by a long one, or 2 short phrases followed by a long one. And a way to think about them, again, this is something I've talked about before, is it's as if they're sentences. When you talk to someone, when you speak, when you write, not all of your sentences are the same length. You'll have a couple of long sentences and then a short one, or vice versa, okay? And that helps to create variety and interest. Now, when you're improvising, typically what's going through my mind when I'm doing this stuff, I'm not thinking this note, then this note, then this note, then this note. I've practiced enough that the notes kind of fall under my fingers, okay? And it's a kind of relationship between my fingers and my ears and what I kind of instinctively know will sound right. And you'll find that comes with practice. What I am thinking about much more is my phrase length, so how long these phrases are going to be, where they're going to start and finish. Okay, let's move on. And back down again. Bit of interest in the left there. Ah, that was interesting. Let's see what I've done there, because I have there very consciously used a bit of a particular scale, and it was the whole tone scale, or one of the two possible whole tone scales. Okay, if we use the whole tone scale starting on G flat, it will be the notes G flat, A flat, B flat, C, D, E, and back to the G flat. There's one other possible scale, that basically an inversion of that. That would be the white notes going up there and those two black notes. Yeah. If you want to find out more about whole tone scales, they're incredibly useful. Just Google them. I just use a fragment of whole tone scale going up here. Let's just have a listen to it. And really, it finished on the D. So between the G flat and the D, I was playing the whole tone scale, but that E flat doesn't belong to that whole tone scale. Okay, that's diatonic 2. It's naturally occurring in B flat major. So I just use a little bit of the whole tone scale there. Notice where I used it. It was over that E flat major 7, E flat minor 7 chord. Okay, so that's a very non-diatonic and non-naturally occurring sound in B flat major, and to kind of mirror the exotic sound in the left there, I use that whole tone scale. Don't have to, it was just a kind of useful, kind of effective thing to do. Let's listen to it again. More movement in the left. Okay, notice there that I have movement in the left and in the right going on at the same time. No reason not to do that. You don't have to swap between them. Okay, let's just listen to that bit again, because it's quite busy there. Okay, in this next section, I want to focus on kind of the variations in range that are going on, and I'm not just talking about movement up and down the keyboard, though there's quite a bit of that. I'm keeping myself in these 2 octaves rather than going high purely to stay in camera shot, really. So I'm staying around here, but listen to the dynamic range that I'm using. So from this point down here, let's just take it to about 25 seconds, and then as I start to head up the keyboard again, listen how I let the volume kind of grow in the right. There we go. And down it comes again. Okay, so a bit of a peak as we got up to there, both in terms of the pitch of the notes and the volume, and back down again. When you're playing really softly, by the way, one thing to keep an eye out for is that you're not drowning out the right by being too chunky in the left. So at the very, very start of the piece, let's go back and listen to the very start. I was taking great pains to keep that left hand soft. Yeah, notice how the right hand, I'm kind of making it sing out and holding back the left. That's quite difficult. You need to practice the left hand to get that kind of control there. Right, back to where we were. So, what am I doing in terms of the notes here? Actually, let's go back a little bit. Let's look at what's happening as we come down here. That's more of that kind of stuff that's very much about the B flat major scale, focusing on the pentatonic notes, B flat, C, D, F and G, but dropping in some of the blue notes, the chromatic notes, things like the diminished sixth, things like that. Again, to start with, that will all be about making conscious choices and experimenting with the sounds, but eventually you should, I mean, always listen to the notes you're producing, because then you'll learn what notes produce which kind of sound, and it's using your ear really that produces those long flowing lines like that with interest in them, rather than consciously thinking about what's going on. Let's go a bit further. That's an interesting thing there. On that E flat minor 7 chord, I've completely lifted that out and replaced it with a G flat major 7. Okay, so that was that. Let's find it. There we go. So there's the E flat major 7. Yeah, very quick snatch on the G flat major 7 there, and I'm going to jump down to the root of that chord. I could equally well go down to the E flat, which would essentially make the chord an E flat minor 9, but I'm keeping that sort of major 7 sound. Yeah, so just an example of the kind of things you can play around with in the left there. Okay, let's go into the middle section. How am I deciding my notes there? Left hand is pretty simple, I'm just playing block chords. The right hand notes are kind of a little bit trickier. I am going for quite a bluesy sound and not going a million miles from the B flat tonality in the right at least, but the overall kind of sound in the right there is kind of defined, I suppose, by use of the D blues scale, really. So I'm using D, I'm using an F natural, I'm using an A flat and various other bits and pieces, certainly for the D chord and the G chord. Okay, that is not the consequence of me thinking through loads of music theory on the spot. It's just because I know what sound I will get if I press those notes, because I've played them so many times before. It's all about the practice, it's all about learning the sound. So I'm not saying to myself when I get to that point, okay, I'm going to go for D blues or D Dorian or whatever. It's about hitting the notes that I know will sound right because I've practiced them. Okay, really, really important thing. So much of learning this kind of skill, learning improvisation, isn't just learning which notes to press, it's learning about the sounds that you're making. People often overlook that. Let's keep going. Similar sort of tonality on the G chord, like I said. Slightly more of a kind of C tonality, so we've got the underlying chord here is C7. I'm playing a rootless C9. You could call that E minor 7 flat 5 if you want to, but it's probably easier to think of it as a rootless C9. In the right, I dropped the E natural in there, so we've got a little bit more of that C type tonality. And there you see I used that rootless, well, to start with it was rootless F13 and then came down to the root here and then dropped in a quick tritone substitution. I let the left do a fair amount of the heavy lifting there. Here we go. F13, root, tritone sub, but in the right, and there we are back to the start of the final A section. Okay, so much of this is, like I said, I wouldn't say it's an entirely instinctive, entirely natural skill, because a lot of learning goes into doing something like this. But learning the scales, learning the notes, learning the theory, and I go on and on about this in my tutorials, and I'm sorry about that, but it's really important. Learning all that theoretical stuff is perhaps handy to start with, but what you should be aiming for is getting a knowledge of the sounds, yeah, because that will result in much more fluent improvisation. Let's hear this final A section. Okay, just slowing up the tempo there. I wish I'd done that a little bit more evenly. That's a bit rocky just there. Let's just listen to it again. Oh, by the way, I really like that little suspension on the B flat 7. See what I did there? Onto that B flat 7 chord. Just play the E flat for a second. I mentioned this a few minutes ago in the section on chords, but just on it and down to the D again. I think that's always a really nice sound. Here we go. Bit more of that whole tone scale, and that, yeah, that kind of ritenuto. I would have ideally played that a little bit more evenly than actually it was, but it wasn't too bad. Let's just hear it again. So I'm slowing up for the end of the piece, and a bit of playing around towards the end. Okay, so like I said, if you're relatively new, then focus on getting that left hand sorted first. Check out my other tutorials on jazz piano, including that jazz piano series I was talking about. Link in the description text and in the PDF. Sort that left hand out first. Then look at the right hand, starting on just one or two notes and gradually building out from there. And always, always, always listening to the sounds that you're making, and learn and remember the sounds that you're making, because in the long run that's a much more efficient way of learning to do this kind of thing than memorizing dozens and dozens of scales. Okay, and always thinking, oh, I've got this chord, I must play this scale, I've got this chord, I must play this scale, because that just leads to really kind of choppy improvisation. Okay, so that's kind of it. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Don't forget to grab the PDF so you can practice it for yourself. You'll find that link down in the description text right underneath this tutorial. As usual, if you're not subscribed to my channel, please do hit the red subscribe button, and also don't forget to follow me on social media. Twitter, Facebook and Instagram links are all below. Okay, happy piano playing. I'll see you next time.